The streets were alive with the sounds of commerce, the clink of coins, the low hum of voices negotiating, the creak of carts as they made their way over cobblestones. Yet beneath the bustle, just out of sight, there existed another world. A world not captured in the grand tapestries or carved into stone. A world whose workers remain nameless and forgotten. In the warm glow of lanterns and torches, as merchants hawked their wares and nobles debated in the safety of their high walls, there were those whose labour shaped the very survival of the village, but whose names never made it into the records. These unseen hands worked in the shadows, quietly stitching the fabric of society together. In narrow alleys, where daylight barely reached, smoke-filled workshops buzzed with activity. Here, hands worked tirelessly, shaping leather, mending tools, weaving cloth small, intimate acts that went unnoticed by the grand stage of history. These were the labourers of the night, the ones whose tasks were too odd, too strange, or too unsettling to be openly acknowledged. And yet, without them, the wheel of medieval life would have ground to a halt. In the stillness of these hidden corners, there was no room for the formalities of guilds or noblemen. There were no records, no parchment, no statues to mark the passage of their work. Only the flickering light of a candle, casting long shadows against worn stone walls. Their lives were lived on the fringes, performing tasks that were essential, but deemed too sacred, too unsettling, or simply too strange to be openly recognized. And perhaps this was their greatest secret. These trades existed not because they were unimportant, but because they were uncomfortable. Their very existence threatened to expose truths about power, belief, and fear that no one wished to face. It wasn't that these trades were irrelevant or inconsequential. No, they were foundational. But they were hidden in the quiet spaces of life, tucked away where few could look without feeling a sense of unease. Perhaps it was the very strangeness of their duties that led to their erasure from the record after all. What could be more disquieting than the idea of an entire workforce that we never see, never acknowledge, and yet depends upon? These invisible workers shaped towns, kept the markets running, maintained the fragile order of the medieval world, yet in their obscurity they were forgotten, erased by the very forces that relied on them. What would the world look like if we could see them? If we could glimpse, even for a moment, the lives that pulsed in the dark alleys and the hidden corners? What truths might be uncovered about the power structures, the beliefs, and the fears that shaped the world we thought we knew? The more we consider their absence from history, the more we begin to wonder, were they erased to protect us from what they knew, or was their work too unsettling to acknowledge, even in the quietest corners of the village? Perhaps these forgotten trades weren't simply a relic of the past. Perhaps they are still with us, woven into the fabric of our world, hidden just out of view, waiting to be uncovered. If we listen closely, we might hear their faint echo, reverberating through the quiet spaces we've long since overlooked. And as the night deepens, we are left with a question that lingers. What was lost when these workers vanished from the record? In the shadow of every disaster, when the world seemed to tremble on the brink of collapse, there arose individuals who thrived where fear festered. The medieval world, a place already woven with superstition and unexplainable events, saw its darkest moments plagues, strange illnesses, unexplained phenomena in the sky give birth to new roles, ones that skirted the edges of accepted society. These were the men and women who dealt in forbidden texts, whispered incantations, and strange remedies, offering their services only when the need was most desperate. It was in times of crisis, when fear was thick in the air, that these trades became not just useful, but essential. The fear was palpable, woven into the very fabric of daily life. Plagues swept through villages, leaving only devastation in their wake. Strange lights flickered in the night sky, sparking whispers of omens or divine wrath. Curses were believed to linger in the very soil, poisoning the land, while famines ravaged harvests and forced the townsfolk to question the very fabric of reality. It was during these moments, when the earth seemed to recoil from its own inhabitants, that the people turned to those who knew things. The rest dared not speak of individuals who could read the skies, interpret omens, or speak in the forgotten tongues of ancient remedies. But these trades were not welcomed in the light of day. They existed in hushed corners, in the twilight hours when the streets were empty and the world seemed to hold its breath. Secret meetings took place in candle-lit rooms, where whispered consultations were exchanged for small bags of coins, left in silence under doors. The trades these individuals practiced were born from a world that no longer made sense, a world in which only desperation could push the boundaries of what was acceptable. Yet, even as society relied on these workers tapping into ancient rituals and forgotten knowledge, their existence was kept at a distance, an uncomfortable truth pushed to the edge of the collective memory. In the dead of night, these individuals were the ones who moved like shadows, their very presence an acknowledgement of the things people dared not confront. There were no formal names for them, no titles bestowed by the guilds. Their work was not recorded in the annals of history, not because it lacked importance, but because it was uncomfortable. It forced people to confront the darkest corners of their beliefs, to acknowledge forces they preferred to ignore. The healers who whispered old prayers over the sick, the soothsayers who read the whispers of the wind, the apothecaries who prepared potions too potent for ordinary hands, they existed on the fringes, a necessary evil in a world too afraid to fully accept them. The tension built, thick as fog. People sought them out in secret, desperate for any glimmer of hope, any sliver of understanding in a world gone mad. Yet, even as they relied on these workers, they could not embrace them. There was a quiet shame in needing the help of those who dealt with the unseen, the unnatural. In these dark, hidden moments, society's dependence on these trades was evident. And yet, they were still denied a place in the light. For fear, after all, was not only something that infected the body, it reached deep into the heart of a community, into its beliefs and its very way of seeing the world. The question arose, what kind of person could become essential only when the world feels like it's ending? What force, hidden in the fear and the unknown, could create such individuals workers whose names we'll never know, but whose influence lingers like an echo through the centuries? As these workers found their roles more indispensable, they became dangerous in the eyes of those who ruled. Their influence grew to such an extent that some leaders sought to control or silence them entirely. What happens when the people who operate on the fringes become too powerful, too crucial to ignore? It's a question that has lingered in the darkness for centuries, and one that will be answered as we move further into the mystery of these forgotten trades. History has a way of erasing those who do not fit into its neat, tidy narratives. There are entire professions, entire lives, that never made it into the records. They vanished not because they were unimportant, but because the forces of power, belief, and order needed them to disappear. The medieval world, with its rigid social structures and its obsession with control, found certain workers too unsettling, too dangerous to acknowledge. And so, they were erased, deliberately, methodically, and with great care. Chroniclers of the time, tasked with preserving the stories of the world, wrote only what was acceptable to the powers that be. What did not align with the official narrative, what could not be explained within the rigid confines of the church or the state, was quietly omitted. The workers who dealt in forbidden knowledge, who practiced rites too strange for the public eye, disappeared without so much as a mention. Their names, their stories, their very existence were deemed unworthy of recording. But it wasn't just the chroniclers. The guilds, powerful entities that controlled the flow of work and knowledge in medieval towns, held sway over what was considered acceptable. Anything outside of their strict codes was branded as unregulated, illegal, even dangerous. Unapproved crafts, those practiced in the shadows, were forbidden, their practitioners cast out of formal society. These workers were pushed to the edges, forced to practice their trades in secrecy, away from the prying eyes of those who upheld the order of the time. For guilds, these professions posed a threat both to their power and to their carefully crafted understanding of what the world should be. So, they erased them, sweeping them from the public record, ensuring that no trace of their existence would remain. And then there were the religious authorities, whose grip on knowledge and truth was absolute. They condemned anything that blurred the lines between the sacred and the forbidden. Those who dared to dabble in practices that strayed from the church's teachings were branded as heretics, witches, or worse. The lives of these workers were often reduced to little more than faint whispers in dusty, forgotten manuscripts, stories of ritualistic practices, healing potions, and dark omens erased by the very hands that claimed to hold the truth. These workers were dangerous not just because of what they did, but because of what they represented, a challenge to the very authority that the church and the state sought to maintain. Their erasure was a calculated move, designed to protect the power structures that govern the lives of all medieval people. What happens when an entire profession is erased on purpose? What is lost when the very essence of a trade, one that was vital to the survival of society, is cast into the void of history? The answer is both simple and tragic. The voices of those who shaped the world are silenced. Their work is forgotten, their lives reduced to myths, their contributions never acknowledged. The lives of these workers are scattered across time, like shards of broken glass, hidden in the cracks of history, waiting to be discovered. In the quiet corners of medieval towns, entire communities relied on these workers. Their lives were interwoven with the fabric of society, yet they remain nameless, their stories untold. To uncover them is to resurrect forgotten voices, to breathe life back into the shadows where they once thrived. Their erasure is a wound in the historical record, a wound that we can only begin to heal by uncovering the truth of their existence. These workers are not just forgotten, they have been intentionally erased, their contributions hidden beneath layers of time and power. This act of erasure is not just about the loss of names, but the loss of understanding. What were these workers doing in the dark alleys and hidden workshops? What knowledge did they possess that was so dangerous, so unsettling, that it could not be allowed to survive? These are the questions we must answer, and in doing so, we uncover more than just forgotten professions. We reveal the fragile, ever-shifting boundaries of power, belief, and control that shaped the medieval world. As we move forward, we begin to peel back the layers of history, searching for the workers who were lost to time, their stories erased but not forgotten. In the next chapters, we will reimagine these hidden trades, bring their names back to life, and explore what they can teach us about the forgotten corners of our own world. In the stillness of the night, long before the first rays of dawn touched the rooftops, there were those who kept watch over the sleeping world. The streets, bathed in the soft glow of flickering lanterns, felt both familiar and strange. Shadows stretched long and dark against the cobblestones, whispering secrets of the night. And in the midst of this quiet, moving unseen, were the watchers, the silent sentinels who kept vigil when the rest of the town rested. These individuals had no official title, no armor or badges to declare their authority. They were neither part of the watch nor the guard, yet they were trusted because they understood the rhythm of the night. They knew that darkness carried its own language, one that could not be read in daylight. Every crackle of a distant fire, every rustle in the bushes, every flicker of light through an unshuttered window, these were the things that the night-bound watchers understood. They moved through the streets like ghosts, unseen and unnoticed, observing everything but demanding nothing. Their purpose was simple, yet vital: to observe, to listen, to protect. They were tasked with spotting dangers before they could spread fires that threatened to consume entire blocks, strange travelers whose presence could indicate trouble, omens that might foretell something far worse. But the real value of the Watchers lay not in the things they were meant to notice, but in the things they understood that others never could. They weren't just observing the movements of people, they were attuned to the pulse of the night itself. The world after sunset was a different place, a place where the boundaries between what was known and what was feared blurred. On a single night, a watcher might walk the familiar streets, yet everything would seem subtly out of place. There might be a flicker of light from an upstairs window where none had been before, a distant sound that didn't quite belong, the scrape of a cartwheel when none should be rolling, the creak of a door opening softly, yet no one visible. To the casual observer, it would be nothing, but to the watcher, it spoke volumes. They would move slowly, their footsteps muffled by the thick carpet of night. At the edge of the town, beyond the reach of the torchlight, they would listen to the wind carrying whispers of strange things. Sometimes, a glimmer of movement in the dark would draw their attention, an unfamiliar shape, shifting in the moonlight. In moments like these, the watchers had no choice but to stay hidden, observing quietly, trying to understand the truth of what they saw. They were not there to confront or challenge. Their duty was simply to know whether it was a fire smouldering beneath the surface of a seemingly innocent wall, or a person carrying something far more dangerous than they should. There was something almost sacred in the role of these watchers, something in their silence that made them seem both part of the world and separate from it. They were the guardians of secrets that the day could not hold. While the streets were filled with life and energy during the daylight hours, at night the town was a different place. It became a stage for whispers and mysteries, for things that could not be explained, only observed. The watchers held a unique power in their quietude. They could see things that others could not or would not see. Their eyes were accustomed to the dark, their minds trained to perceive the subtle movements that made the night alive. What they saw, though, was not always understood, and so they remained silent, often with no one the wiser for their watchful presence. What did they see in the darkness that no one else dared record? What truths did they uncover as the world slept? Truths that could never be spoken aloud, never written down, but lived in the quiet spaces between the shadows. The night was a world unto itself, and the watchers were the only ones who truly understood it. But what if they weren't just watching for human threats? What if they were looking for something else, something far darker, far more mysterious? Perhaps the answer lies not in the shadows of the streets, but in the very hearts of those who wandered beneath the moonlit sky. As we move forward, we'll see that these watchers were not the only ones whose eyes were open when others slept. There were those who listened for things that the night whispered, things no one else dared hear. In the quiet stretches of the medieval world, where the moonlight barely pierced the dense canopies of forests and the air hummed with secrets, there were those whose ears were attuned to a different rhythm. These were the listeners, the individuals who could hear the silence between the sounds, the ones who noticed when the world fell unnaturally still. To the untrained ear, these silences were nothing but the absence of sound, a fleeting pause in the constant flow of nature's noises. But to the listener, they were far more. They were warnings. They were messages. A strange stillness in the forest, a sudden absence of rustling leaves, the unusual quiet of the underbrush was enough to send a listener's pulse quickening. In the distance, where the river usually gurgled with life, there was a sudden absence, a deep silence that could no longer be ignored. These were not the normal rhythms of nature. Something was wrong. Perhaps a predator was near, or maybe something even stranger, a disturbance that none but the keenest of ears could detect. And when it happened, it was the listeners who could make sense of it. Their job was not just to hear, but to interpret. They were environmental interpreters of a sort, blending superstition with practical knowledge, using their deep connection with nature to read the signs others could not. They moved between the wilderness and civilization, walking the edges of the known world where the wild met the tamed. With each trip, they gathered information, piecing together patterns that would be invisible to anyone else. A silence here, an absence there, these were the pieces of a puzzle only they could solve. To a listener, the absence of birdsong was a far more telling sign than the song of the birds themselves. When the usual chorus of birds in the morning light fell away, it was often seen as an omen, a sign that something was amiss. Was there a predator nearby? A storm coming? Or was it the subtle influence of an unseen force? The questions lingered in the quiet air, and it was the listener's job to find the answers. Their world was one of intuition, not science. There were no written records to explain why the wind felt heavier tonight, or why the trees whispered in a language no one could understand. But for those who listened, these were not just coincidences. They were truths veiled beneath the ordinary. The absence of a certain rustling in the leaves, the unnatural stillness of a familiar path, these were signs that could not be ignored. They spoke of things unseen, forces moving just beneath the surface of the world. And it wasn't just in the wilds where the listeners worked. In the small towns, they listened to the changes in the air, the subtle shift in the atmosphere that others failed to notice. It was in the way the air grew heavier before a storm, the way the dogs stopped barking long before the sound of thunder reached the village. The listeners, with their heightened awareness, were the first to feel the tremors of impending change. Their gift, if it could be called that, was both a blessing and a burden. They understood nature in a way that others could not, yet this understanding came at a price. They were bound to the land, to the rhythms of the earth, and their work required them to remain attuned to every change, every whisper of the world around them. What kind of medieval trade revolved around listening to things that weren't there? It was a trade rooted in an understanding of nature's subtleties, those things that cannot be touched but must be felt. It wasn't about what could be seen or measured. It was about what could be sensed, what could be heard in the silences. A listener's skill was not about gathering information, but about interpreting the absence of it. And in a world steeped in superstition, that was a power all its own. As time passed, the work of these listeners became more and more important. They warned of approaching storms, of predators in the distance, and of dangers both natural and supernatural. Yet, with their growing influence, the lines between practicality and superstition began to blur. Some listeners began predicting events with uncanny accuracy, predicting when crops would fail, when sickness would spread, when conflicts would arise. Their skills, once seen as a gift, began to spark fear. If they could predict the future with such precision, what else could they know? And with that fear came a desire to silence them. The listeners, once revered, were now seen as threats, and as the centuries turned, their knowledge faded into obscurity. The very skill that had made them so valuable became the reason for their suppression. And as these listeners were driven into silence, another shadow trade began to rise, one that moved even deeper into the realm of the unknown, where no one dared listen at all. The night sky has always been a place of mystery, stretching endlessly above us, filled with stars that seem to whisper secrets to those who dare to listen. In medieval towns, there were those who did more than simply look up at the heavens, they read the signs. They were the sky watchers, individuals whose eyes were trained to decipher the cosmic messages written across the stars, comets, and strange lights that occasionally flashed across the sky. To some, they were scholars of the unknown. To others, they were mystics, interpreters of divine will. These observers weren't part of the formal academic world. They weren't the astronomers employed by kings or the official priests interpreting scripture. Instead, they were often solitary figures, working outside the bounds of officialdom, blending a strange mix of scientific curiosity and spiritual belief. They watched the heavens from rooftops, high towers, or open fields, where the sky seemed closer and the stars brighter. With nothing but their keen observations and the knowledge passed down through whispers and ancient texts, they studied the stars for signs of things yet to come. The sky was alive with meaning for these individuals. Comets, with their fiery tails, were omens of great change, perhaps the birth of a new ruler or the fall of an empire. A rare alignment of planets could signal a shift in the cosmic order. The movement of constellations was not merely a matter of physics, it was a language, and the sky watchers were its translators. To them, every flicker of light in the heavens held meaning, a message from the gods, from fate, or from the very fabric of the universe itself. The night was their canvas, and they painted pictures of the future with the stars. Yet, for all their insight, they were not universally embraced. While some saw their wisdom as a valuable tool, others feared the power they held. A comet might foretell a coming disaster. A celestial event could signal the rise of a new power, and the alignment of the stars might herald a shift in the social or political order. Leaders, wary of these cosmic predictions, knew that the sky watchers could sway public opinion with little more than a well-timed prophecy. The stars might show them the future, but they could also alter the course of history. But this power, too, was dangerous. If a sky watcher foretold the fall of a ruler or the rise of rebellion, their words could change the course of nations. For a medieval leader, this was not a comforting thought. Who could control such power? And what could be more unsettling than the idea that the fate of a kingdom might lie in the hands of someone who merely observed the night sky? Thus, the sky watchers were treated with a mixture of awe and fear. Some were invited into the courts of rulers, acting as advisors, their prophecies used to guide important decisions. Others were seen as threats, individuals whose knowledge might tip the scales of power in dangerous ways. In the quiet corners of towns, far from the reach of official scholars, these sky readers influenced decisions that affected the very future of their communities. They might not have had the power of kings, but they wielded something just as potent, the ability to predict the future. Yet as their influence grew, so did the fears of those in power. As the years passed, the sky watchers' role began to diminish. Some were replaced by sanctioned astrologers, official figures whose influence was controlled and regulated by the church and the state. Others were banned altogether, their practices condemned as heresy or superstition. Their knowledge, so revered in its time, became something to be feared, and the whispers of the night sky were drowned out by the louder voices of those in power. The stars that had once guided decisions now seemed distant, their meanings lost in the shuffle of history. Why did medieval leaders fear those who watched the sky too closely? What was so dangerous about understanding the movements of the heavens, about reading the language of the stars? Perhaps it was the simple truth that the watchers saw patterns others could not, glimpses of fate and destiny that threatened to unravel the carefully woven fabric of the known world. Perhaps it was the knowledge that in their quiet observance of the night, these individuals held the power to shape the course of history itself. And in a world that preferred control, such power was too unsettling to allow. As we turn our attention to the next chapter, we will see that the trades tied to the sky were not the only ones that dealt with uncertainty and fear. Some professions went even deeper, touching on the private fears of individuals, the hidden parts of their lives, where knowledge was not about what could be seen, but about what could be known, things that had been buried, things no one dared speak aloud. At the edge of the known world, where the forest thickens and the riverbanks grow wild, there existed a quiet group of workers, unseen, unheard, and often misunderstood. These were the gatherers of forbidden plants, individuals who ventured into the untamed wilds at dawn or under the cover of moonlight, searching for herbs and roots that ordinary hands could not touch. These plants were not just simple remedies, they were powerful, potent, and often considered too dangerous for the common person to handle. Their properties were steeped in mystery, whispered about in dark corners of the village, their names spoken only in hushed tones. For those who knew the land and its secrets, these plants offered a lifeline, a remedy when all other options had failed. But such knowledge came with a price. The gatherers moved in silence, their every step measured, their eyes scanning the undergrowth for the familiar shapes of the plants they sought. Their knowledge was passed down through generations, a carefully guarded secret known only to those few who had been taught the ancient ways. This knowledge was not written in books or scrolls, for it was too dangerous, too sacred to be recorded. Instead, it lived in the minds of those who walked the earth with the land, those who could read the rhythms of the forest, understand the language of the wind, and recognize the subtle shifts in the natural world. Each dawn, as the first light of the sun kissed the treetops, they would set out, guided by memory, knowing exactly where to find the twisted roots, the dew-covered leaves, and the plants that held the key to healing and protection. But the deeper they went into the forest, the more they ventured into the realms of the forbidden. These plants were not just remedies for illness or injury. Some were used in rituals, their leaves and roots woven into ceremonies that blurred the lines between the sacred and the profane. Others were used to ward off evil spirits or to invoke powers that were beyond human comprehension. These were not plants to be used lightly. A single misstep, a careless use of their power, could bring disastrous results. Those who wielded this knowledge were often met with suspicion and fear. In a world where control was everything, there were few who were comfortable with the idea of someone possessing knowledge that could sway the balance of power. And yet, despite the risks, these gatherers were essential. They were the last line of defense when the conventional remedies had failed, when the healer's hands could do no more. The plants they gathered were used in desperate moments, when no one else dared to seek out such forbidden knowledge. In the stillness of the night, under the watchful gaze of the moon, these workers would carefully harvest the herbs, their hands steady, their movements quiet. They knew the importance of their task. This was not just about healing, this was about survival, and the stakes could not have been higher. But as with all things hidden, this knowledge came at a cost. Those who possessed the ability to gather such potent plants were often at the mercy of those who feared what they knew. Envy, superstition, and fear of the unknown could quickly turn to accusation. To be accused of witchcraft, of dabbling in forces beyond understanding, was a fate that often befell those who worked with such dangerous herbs. The gatherers were frequently isolated, their work done in secret, and the communities they served remained unaware of just how deeply they relied on these quiet workers. For while the plants held immense power, they were also a powerful source of fear. And fear, as always, had a way of erasing what it could not control. There were those who ventured into the forest and never returned, their fates lost to time, replaced by only whispers and rumors. Some say they were claimed by the very plants they sought, their lives swallowed by the wild, consumed by the forces they had dared to control. Others believe they were taken by those who sought to silence them, to erase their knowledge before it could spread further. Who wandered the early morning woods, searching for plants no one dared name aloud? Who dared to walk the fine line between salvation and destruction, to gather the knowledge that the world was too frightened to acknowledge? These were the silent workers of the wilds, the ones who ventured where no one else could, gathering secrets that lived in the dark places of the earth. And though their names have faded into the mist of history, their work remains woven into the fabric of the past. As the plants they gathered entered the hands of those who could use them, their journey didn't end there. The herbs found their way into hidden workshops, where they were transformed into remedies, potions, and elixirs. These workshops were just as secretive as the gatherers themselves, and it is there, in the quiet corners of the village, where the real power of these plants came to life. In the quietest corners of medieval towns, there were those who worked with substances so potent, so deeply entwined with life and death, that their craft had to be hidden away. These were the mixers, the individuals who transformed rare plants, minerals, and even animal parts into remedies that could alter the course of a person's life. They weren't public healers, with a shop adorned with signs and symbols of their trade. Instead, they worked in shadowed rooms, behind closed doors, creating tonics, potions, and elixirs that were used only in the most delicate of circumstances, when no other treatment could be trusted, when hope had nearly slipped away. Their work began with the quiet hum of grinding stone, the rhythmic motion of wooden bowls and pestles echoing softly in the candle-lit stillness. With practiced hands, they mixed ingredients, each chosen for its potency, its rarity, and its precise ability to address the specific needs of the moment. These were not simple concoctions. The ingredients were often not only physically powerful, but also spiritually charged. A pinch of powdered root here, a carefully measured drop of oil there, and perhaps a prayer murmured over the boiling mixture. For these mixers, the act of creation was as much about intention as it was about knowledge. Each step was deliberate, each motion honed over years of secret practice. There was an understanding that these mixtures weren't just remedies, they were lifelines, fragile bridges between the mortal world and something far less understood. The tonics they made were often tailored for situations that could not be spoken aloud in polite company. Whether it was a remedy for a loved one slipping into madness, a salve for a body broken by illness, or a potion meant to soothe the soul in the wake of grief, these mixtures served in moments too delicate for any public healer to handle. They were the trusted hands that crafted solutions to problems that could not be acknowledged, let alone treated openly. These mixers weren't criminals, though their trade was often viewed with suspicion. Their work was a necessary evil, a quiet act of defiance against the rigid boundaries of medical practice and spiritual law. There was a trust involved in seeking out these mixers, but it was a trust born from desperation, from the need to do whatever it took to relieve suffering. People came to them in the dead of night, leaving packages or payments at their doorstep in silence. No one spoke of the mixers publicly, their names were kept out of conversation, for to acknowledge them would be to acknowledge the delicate balance between what was considered holy and what was not. They worked at the edges of the known world, on the thin line between healing and heresy. For those who came seeking their help, the mixers were both saviors and shadows. No one dared speak of them in the daylight hours, for the things they dealt with were too fraught with danger mentally, physically, and spiritually. Their potions could heal or harm, could calm or inflame, could ease a troubled mind or plunge it deeper into madness. In this delicate balance between salvation and destruction, the mixers remained hidden, their work whispered about only in hushed tones. The remedies they crafted were essential to the people who needed them, but society at large kept its distance, wary of the fine line between using their knowledge for good and using it for something far darker. What remedies were crafted in silence, used only in moments no one dared describe? This was the question that lingered in the air of their workshops, where the mixers toiled away under the flicker of candlelight, their faces hidden in the shadows. Their work was as essential as it was secret. It was a trade based on trust, yet one that could not be spoken of without a hint of suspicion. In many ways, the mixers existed in a world of their own creation, a world where the boundaries between hope and superstition were so fragile that even a whispered prayer could tip the scales between life and death. But as their mixtures gained power and influence, their role became more complex. It wasn't just about healing anymore, it was about what these mixers knew, what they might uncover in the course of their work. The more they created, the more they saw of the people who came to them in search of answers. And some, it seemed, had come not just for remedies, but for revelations, hidden truths that they were not meant to know. This shifting balance between healer and confessor would soon bring them face to face with forces they could never have anticipated, leading them into a realm where the line between what they could heal and what they could expose became ever more uncertain. The secrecy of these mixers' work leads us into the next shadowed corner of the trade, where some practitioners weren't feared for what they healed, but for what they might reveal. As we step deeper into this world, we find that some of these hidden workers carried knowledge that could shake the very foundations of the community. In the quiet corners of medieval villages, there were those who listened. Not as priests, not as doctors, but as silent observers of the human soul, those who gathered the broken pieces of confessions, fears, and guilt. They were the ones who knew things without asking, who could hear the unspoken, the things people could not or would not share with anyone else. Theirs was a quiet profession, built on trust and silence, a space where the weight of the world's burdens could be laid down, if only for a moment. In dimly lit rooms, with nothing but the soft glow of candlelight flickering in the shadows, whispered confessions filled the air, guilt over hidden crimes, fear of a future slipping out of control, or the heavy burden of a secret too dangerous to share with anyone else. These listeners were not bound by any official title, nor did they have the weight of religious or medical authority. They were outsiders in the world of official roles, and yet they held power that came from their understanding of human vulnerability. People sought them out not just for advice, but for a safe space where they could voice the darkest parts of themselves. The listeners did not judge, they simply received what was offered, creating a quiet sanctuary where truth could be spoken without fear of condemnation. The listeners, however, were more than just silent observers. They understood patterns, human patterns, the subtle shifts in behavior that signaled distress long before it was visible. They had a keen sense of when someone was lying, when the weight of a secret had begun to bend a person's soul. It was this skill, this deep understanding of human nature, that made them invaluable and feared. They could predict upheavals in the community, recognize when tensions were rising beneath the surface, and sometimes they could even sense when a disaster was about to unfold. A secret spoken in the dead of night, a quiet confession given by the light of a candle, these whispers held power, and the listeners could read them like an open book. But this ability came with a price. The deeper they listened, the more they understood the darkest corners of human nature, secrets that could shatter lives, fear that could unravel the very fabric of a community. The listeners were often seen as a threat, not because of what they heard, but because of what they knew. Villagers began to believe that these listeners could see into the heart of a person's soul, uncovering truths that no one else could. And when someone could peer into the most intimate fears of the people around them, when they could predict the rise and fall of conflicts, what was left to control? Could such knowledge be trusted? Or did it pose a danger to those who ruled over the village, who sought to maintain order and stability? For all their power, the listeners were not always welcomed. Some villagers revered them, seeking their counsel in moments of crisis, while others feared them, suspecting that their insight gave them an unnatural hold over the fate of the community. The more a listener understood, the more others saw them as a mirror to their own vulnerabilities they would rather keep hidden. In some cases, the listeners were quietly removed from positions of influence, shunned by those who feared their knowledge. In others, they were subtly silenced, their ability to understand too threatening to be allowed to persist. What happens when someone understands a village's fears better than the people who rule it? It's a question that lingers in the air, for to know the fears and weaknesses of others is to hold power, and to hold power in a community built on secrecy and control is to exist in a fragile space where trust can quickly turn to fear. The listeners did not just understand the people, they understood the world in a way that others could not, and it was this deep understanding that ultimately shaped the fate of the community. But as the listeners grew too influential, as their knowledge of human frailty threatened the delicate balance of power, they began to disappear from public view. Some simply faded into the background, their work left unspoken, while others were driven out of the community altogether, their ability to listen and predict becoming too dangerous for the rulers to allow. In the end, these quiet listeners were not only the ones who understood the fears of others, they were the ones who sometimes protected the community from dangers no one wanted to acknowledge. They were the silent sentinels, guarding against the forces of chaos that lurked just beneath the surface, but their place in the world of the medieval village was precarious at best. As we move into Chapter 4, we will see that the hidden professions didn't just offer guidance, They were also the ones who held the keys to keeping their communities safe from forces that no one dared name. There are places that the world leaves behind: ruins, forgotten buildings, desolate fields where nothing seems to grow but the whispers of things better left undisturbed. And in the darkest corners of medieval villages, where superstition and fear held sway, there were those who watched over these spaces, guardians of the forgotten, the cursed, the dangerous. They were the wardens of abandoned places, hired to stand sentinel over locations that no one else dared approach. These weren't places of life or commerce, but of death, decay, and the eerie silence of things no longer welcome in the world of the living. The job of these wardens was not to confront the danger within these spaces, it was simply to guard them from the outside world. They were chosen for their temperament, quiet, patient, and willing to sit with the unknown. While others fled from crumbling houses, burial fields, or ruined mills, these guardians remained behind, watching with steady eyes, ensuring that the shadows within these forsaken places did not spill out into the village. They did not disturb the ruins, but neither did they allow them to become more than they were: dangerous remnants of a world better forgotten. Their presence was often unnoticed as the wind that passed through the broken windows of a collapsed home, or the eerie rustling of leaves on a long-abandoned path. They would walk the half-lit trails, where the fog hung thick and the air seemed always on the verge of something unspeakable. There was no ceremony, no grand gesture marking their work. They simply moved quietly through the ruins, ensuring that the unknown stayed where it belonged. To the villagers, these wardens were barely a thought, except in the most dire of circumstances, when something strange happened, when the wind shifted in an unsettling way, when a long-forgotten structure seemed to breathe once more. Then the warden's role became known. They were the ones who kept the dangers at bay. And yet, their task was far more profound than mere observation. The wardens were tasked with creating distance between these dangerous places and the lives of the villagers. They served as the buffer, the invisible wall that allowed the community to go on, unaffected by the forces of superstition and fear that could otherwise overwhelm it. Without them, these places of misfortune would have become too much a constant source of anxiety, a reminder that the past was never fully gone, that the spectres of the dead and the cursed could rise again. Who stayed behind when everyone else fled the places said to be touched by misfortune? Who had the strength to remain, not to fight, but simply to watch, to be present in spaces that others refused to acknowledge? These wardens carried the burden of solitude, of living in the quiet spaces between what was and what was never meant to be. Their task was both simple and immense, keeping the village safe from what could never be named, standing as quiet sentinels over places no one dared to enter. But it was not just the physical spaces they guarded. As much as they were protectors of crumbling homes and forgotten fields, they were also guardians of the human mind. The very act of their presence allowed the villagers to continue living, without the weight of unspoken fears pressing down on them. To know that someone stood vigil over the forsaken places, someone who understood the quiet power of forgotten spaces, was enough to keep the shadows at bay. It was a job that required no great heroism, no grand acts of bravery, only the courage to face the unknown and remain still. As we move deeper into the chapter, we'll see that these wardens weren't the only ones tasked with guarding what was best left unnamed. Some wardens protected physical spaces, while others guarded the people within them. Their work was quiet, unnoticed, and vital, a necessary shield against the forces that lurked just out of sight. There are roads that stretch long into the dark, where the night seems to swallow up even the bravest of souls, and the air is thick with uncertainty. Along these roads, in the forgotten corners of medieval villages, there existed a quiet profession, one that no one spoke of openly, but one that was desperately needed. These were the silent escorts, individuals chosen not for their strength or their social standing, but for a unique ability to guide those marked by misfortune through the darkest and most treacherous paths. Their job was simple, yet profoundly essential. They were tasked with escorting travellers who carried something unseen with them, illness, curses, or an unspoken misfortune that tainted them in the eyes of others. They did not walk beside their charges. Instead, they walked behind them, unseen and unnoticed, their presence as much a protective shield as a subtle form of containment. The travellers they guided were often outcasts, individuals whose very existence was a threat to the peace of the villages they passed through. Whether it was a plague-ridden merchant or a pilgrim cursed by dark forces, these travelers were treated with suspicion, fear, and sometimes outright hostility. But the escorts, silent, steady, and ever watchful, ensured that no harm would come to the communities they passed through. The roads were not friendly places at night. They twisted and turned through dense forests, across fields blanketed by mist, and into villages whose inhabitants recoiled at the mere sight of a stranger. Torchlight flickered dimly across damp stones, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly into the night. The escorts knew these roads well, not only because they had walked them countless times, but because they understood the dangers that lay just beyond the reach of light. They knew where the paths became narrow and treacherous, where the woods grew thick and quiet, and where the silence held more than just the absence of sound. In their hands, they carried more than knowledge of the routes they carried, the rituals that could ward off unseen forces, the quiet chants that could ease anxious minds, and the authority that came from a deep understanding of fear itself. These escorts were not always visible to those they passed. Their role was often that of a silent witness, unseen by those who walked ahead, yet ever present in their protection. In some ways, their work was less about physical defense and more about the subtle containment of fear and suspicion. They guided the troubled travelers through communities where no one wanted to acknowledge their presence. They ensured that the travelers were not ostracized, that they would not bring harm to the villages they passed through physically or spiritually. In doing so, the escorts allowed the townspeople to continue with their lives without the burden of confronting the unknown, the unclean, or the cursed. Yet, for all their importance, these silent escorts were often invisible in the eyes of society. They were not celebrated, nor were their actions ever openly acknowledged. Their role was too uncomfortable to admit, too deeply entwined with superstition and fear. The work they did was necessary, but it was a work that people would rather not speak of. It was the kind of profession that thrived on silence and secrecy, an unspoken agreement between the escort and the traveller, one that was understood but never articulated. No one wanted to admit that such individuals were needed, but everyone was grateful for their presence when the time came. The traveller, too, understood the importance of the escort's role, but few would ever thank them. For doing so would be to acknowledge something that no one wanted to confront: the darkness that lay just beneath the surface of the everyday world. Why did some travellers need an escort who walked behind them, never beside them? The question lingers in the quiet of the night, for the truth of this profession lies in the subtle art of containment. It is the understanding that some travellers carry with them forces that are too dangerous to be acknowledged, too unsettling to be seen. And in this delicate balance, the escorts played their part, guiding their charges with a quiet dignity, never asking questions, never drawing attention, but always ensuring that the road remained clear for those who dared to travel it. As we move forward, we begin to see that these escorts were not chosen solely for their knowledge of safe routes or their ability to calm fears. Some of them were chosen for something far deeper, an uncanny instinct that allowed them to sense danger before it arrived, to understand when something was wrong before it could be seen. And as we'll soon discover, this instinct was both their greatest strength and their most unsettling gift. In the quiet spaces between power and decision, where words carried weight and silence held even more, there were those who never spoke, yet whose mere presence shaped the course of events. These were the observers, individuals hired not to act, but to watch, to listen, and to understand the unspoken currents of tension that flowed just beneath the surface. Their role was one of subtlety, of observation that spoke louder than any words could. They stood on the periphery of meetings, ceremonies, and negotiations, their silence serving as both shield and signal, a quiet warning to all those who would dare to deceive or mislead. These observers were not like guards or advisors. They were not there to intervene or influence directly. Their task was far more intricate. They were there to be present, to serve as a reminder that any falsehood, any deception, would be noticed. Their presence alone carried weight, for it was believed that these individuals had the uncanny ability to sense lies, to feel the tension in a room before it became evident to others. Whether this ability was real, or simply the result of their keen observation, it didn't matter. The power of their role lay in the perception of their ability. Villagers whispered about them in hushed tones, passing on stories of how the observers could detect ill intent with nothing more than a glance, a breath, or a shift in posture. In a world where words were often shields, their silence was the sword that cut through deceit. In the cold, dimly lit rooms where leaders gathered to discuss matters of great importance, these observers were the ones who saw beyond the rhetoric, beyond the promises. They understood the body language, the subtle movements that betrayed hidden agendas. Their role was not to reveal what they saw, but to bear witness to it, creating an invisible pressure in the room. To have an observer present was to have an unspoken judge of your words and actions, a silent arbiter whose gaze could unravel your truth. Leaders, wary of the observer's influence, never allowed them to take part in discussions, yet their presence was enough to shape the outcome. Whether it was a subtle glance exchanged, a shift in posture, or the mere tension in the air, these silent guides had the power to tip the scales of fate. Their presence, though, was never welcomed openly. The observers were known for what they could expose, not just for their ability to witness. They didn't need to speak a word. Their silence was enough to alter the course of a conversation, a decision, or even an entire community's fate. This made them both invaluable and dangerous. Leaders, though they relied on them, feared them. To acknowledge that one needed someone to read the truth through silence was to reveal a vulnerability that no leader, no ruler, would ever want the public to know. Over time, these observers became less and less visible, their existence recorded only in whispers. The very idea of such an individual undermined the authority of those in power. No one wanted the people to know that they relied on silent guides to understand the truth. As the official narratives began to tighten, and as control over power and knowledge became more centralized, the observers vanished from the historical record. They were forgotten not because they weren't needed, but because their role made too many uncomfortable. To rely on someone whose only task was to observe and silently interpret the actions of others was to admit a level of uncertainty, a recognition that truth could not always be trusted in its spoken form. What kind of person protects a community without lifting a hand or saying a word? It was this power, this subtle influence that made the observers so remarkable. They were never the ones to speak the final word, but their silence held more power than the loudest proclamations. They protected society not through action but through the simple act of bearing witness. And in this silence, they shaped the outcome of events, the direction of decisions, and the trust between individuals. The mystery surrounding these observers leads us into the next chapter, where hidden professions didn't just sustain society, they shaped its stories. The silent guides may have been forgotten in the official annals, but their influence was deeply embedded in the way communities operated, in the decisions they made, and in the secrets they kept. The line between knowledge and power, between seeing the truth and revealing it, is a thin one, and the observers walked that line with quiet grace, never speaking, yet always knowing. In the shadow of history's grand narratives, where only the victories and the saints were written down, there existed another, quieter version of the past, one that lived in the margins, in secret notebooks, and on scraps of parchment tucked away from the prying eyes of official record keepers. These were the unnamed recorders, the chroniclers of events that were too troubling, too strange, or too inconvenient for the powers of the time to acknowledge. They didn't write for the court historians or for public acclaim. They wrote for themselves, for the people who lived on the edges of society, whose stories were erased by time and authority. Their tools were simple but significant: coded symbols, personal shorthand, or even symbolic drawings. These were not the elegant scripts found in formal manuscripts, but raw, hurried markings made in the quiet hours of the night or the solitude of a forgotten room. The ink was often faded, the paper fragile from years of being hidden away, and the stories they contained were just as ephemeral, capturing disputes, strange weather patterns, unexplained disappearances, and the everyday oddities that were dismissed as superstition or rumor by the mainstream. To an outsider, these records might have seemed meaningless, a jumble of symbols or half-forgotten names. But to those who knew how to read them, these pages held a different kind of truth, a parallel history, one shaped by fear, awe, and the strangeness of the human experience. These chroniclers were not the celebrated historians of their time, and their work was not meant to be shared with the world. Instead, they were the quiet memory keepers of their communities, preserving a version of history that would otherwise have slipped into obscurity. Their records served as a counterpoint to the official narratives, a way to hold on to the moments that history wanted to forget. They wrote not for fame or recognition, but because they understood that the stories of the forgotten were just as important as the stories of the powerful. The presence of these hidden archives is a haunting reminder of the parts of history that were never meant to be preserved. The voices of those who lived in the margins, those whose lives were too strange, too wild, or too difficult to be fit into the neat boxes of official records, are captured in the quiet, often illegible scribbles on parchment. These chroniclers, though unnamed and unnoticed in the public eye, kept alive the memory of things left unsaid, of events too dangerous to record, of people whose lives would have otherwise faded into nothingness. What stories survived only in notebooks that no one was ever meant to find? These are the stories that stir the imagination, that call to the curious and the daring to uncover what was lost, hidden in the corners of time. These fragments of history are not polished or perfect, but they offer a glimpse into a world that existed outside the control of the official record. They are the forgotten lives, the mysterious happenings, and the quiet moments that shape the lives of ordinary people, even if they were never acknowledged in the grand chronicles of the time. As we look deeper into the world of these hidden recorders, we find that their work was not just about documenting the past, it was about carrying the weight of untold stories, of unsung histories that threatened to be erased. And just as they recorded the lives of those who were ignored by the world, so too did they preserve a deeper understanding of the world itself, a world that was full of mysteries, strange happenings, and moments that couldn't be explained. Their job was not only to remember, but to pass that memory on, to ensure that even the smallest, most insignificant moments did not vanish without a trace. The next chapter moves beyond mere recording and into the realm of those who carried knowledge, not just in words or symbols, but in their very being. These were the people who held the stories of their communities in their hearts, who carried the knowledge of the unseen, and who walked with that knowledge through every day and every night. In a world where written records were scarce and often dangerous to keep, there were those whose trade relied not on ink and parchment, but on the power of the mind. These were the memory bearers, individuals who carried with them knowledge too perilous to be written down, family secrets, sensitive agreements, debts, or warnings that could mean the difference between life and death. They were the human archives, walking repositories of information that could not be entrusted to paper or scroll. Each piece of knowledge they held was locked within their minds, where no enemy could seize it, no fire could burn it, and no thief could steal it. For in a world where trust was fragile and fear was a constant companion, these memory bearers held the ultimate power, the ability to recall and deliver vital information, all by the strength of their own memory. Their role was simple yet crucial. They travelled from village to village, town to town, bearing messages too sensitive to risk in writing. They were messengers, but their cargo was not just words, it was the very fabric of a community's hidden truths. When debts needed to be settled, when alliances had to be remembered, or when secret warnings had to be passed on, it was the memory bearers who carried them, often in the dead of night, or through the quiet corridors of inns, where little more than a single candle flickered in the darkness. They recited their memories aloud, their voices soft and deliberate, as if each word carried the weight of centuries. To the villagers, these memory bearers were both revered and feared. Their knowledge was a weapon and a shield. They held the truth of a community's hidden dealings, its skeletons in the closet, and its unspoken agreements. With a single misstep, a memory bearer could bring a village to its knees. Secrets held by one family could be revealed to another, and private deals could be exposed to those with the power to exploit them. Yet, in the right hands, these bearers of memory were invaluable. They could ensure that promises made in the quiet of a room would not be forgotten. They were the living testament to unspoken truths, holding the delicate balance between power and vulnerability. But the life of a memory bearer was one of constant movement and quiet isolation. They were not trusted to remain in one place for too long, for their very presence was a reminder of what could be lost if their minds were ever turned against the village that relied on them. It wasn't just the dangerous knowledge they carried that made them so essential, it was the possibility that, should they be lost or corrupted, that knowledge could be used against everyone they served. For this reason, their profession was as fragile as it was vital. What did medieval travellers carry when their most valuable cargo was locked in their minds? It was a question that only the memory bearers could answer, and the answer was not always comforting. These travellers carried more than just knowledge. They carried the fate of entire communities, wrapped up in their own thoughts, bound by the trust placed in them. And once that trust was broken, there was no going back. Their work, however, did not last forever. As written records became more secure, and as rulers sought more control over their knowledge, the role of the memory bearers began to fade. Written documents, sealed with wax and delivered with the power of the state, replaced the travelling memory bearers. No longer was it enough for a single individual to hold the weight of an entire community's secrets in their mind. The written word could be protected, could be archived, could be controlled. The oral tradition, once so vital, was replaced by a new form of record-keeping, one that was far less personal, but far more secure. For the memory bearers, the shift in how information was transmitted marked the end of an era. Their trade, once the cornerstone of communication in an uncertain world, began to fade into the past, along with the other forgotten professions that once sustained society. They became relics of a time when trust was placed in the human mind, when memory was the ultimate form of security. And though their work was largely forgotten by history, it remains a haunting reminder of how knowledge, once so fragile, has always carried its own power and its own dangers. As we move into the final section of this chapter, we'll discover that the power to carry knowledge wasn't just about remembering it, was about what you could do with it. Some of these hidden professions weren't just silent witnesses to the world, they shaped the stories themselves, becoming the invisible architects of the communities they served. And in the hands of those who truly understood how to wield influence, even the most hidden of professions could bend the course of history. In the quiet spaces between truth and fiction, where rumours grew like weeds and whispers carried on the wind, there existed a group of individuals whose job it was to craft stories not for entertainment, but to shape public belief. These were the story steerers, the unofficial narrators hired by influential figures to manipulate the emotions and perceptions of entire communities. Their trade was not one of fact, but of influence. They didn't write official histories or record events for the ages. They spun tales that were crafted to sway the mood of the public, to turn fear into hope, to guide suspicion into unity, or to fan the flames of fear into unrest. These storytellers did not simply entertain, they guided belief. They wove narratives of heroes and villains, of blessings bestowed and curses uttered, of tragedies and triumphs that never actually happened, but felt as though they had. Through carefully timed tales, they could lift spirits or shatter them. A well-told story could unite a community, shifting the collective mood from anxious uncertainty to confident solidarity. On the other hand, a tale of tragedy or misfortune, perhaps a warning, a vision of doom could twist a community's sense of security, driving people into a fearful frenzy. The power of these story steerers lay in their ability to craft the narrative, to plant ideas and emotions in the hearts of those who listened, often with no idea of the manipulation at play. These storytellers worked in the shadows, never acknowledged but always present. They could be found in marketplaces, around campfires, or in the corners of village gatherings, where they subtly seeded their stories. It was never loud, never overt, just a quiet whisper, a well-placed remark, a sudden tale spun at the right moment. They were masters of timing, understanding that a single tale, introduced at the right time, could shift the course of an entire community's day. A tragic tale told at dusk could cast a shadow over a village's hopes, while a tale of heroes at dawn could inspire them to overcome anything that lay ahead. These stories were designed to provoke, to rally, to divide, or to unite, but always to influence. In many ways, the story steerers were the unseen hands that shaped public opinion. They didn't merely reflect the world as it was, they shaped the world as it was perceived. A well-placed story about a local tragedy could spark mass hysteria, driving villagers to act out of fear rather than reason. Conversely, stories of prosperity or divine favour could lead an entire community to rally behind a leader or cause. The narrative became the reality, and in this way, the story steerers had the power to mould belief and action without ever being seen as the true force behind it. But this power came at a cost. As society began to evolve, and as centralized authorities grew stronger, the ability to influence through storytelling was slowly supplanted. Rulers and institutions that once relied on these unofficial narrators to manage public sentiment began to take control of the narrative themselves. Written records, state-sponsored historians, and official decrees replaced the stories told in whispers. The craft of the story steerers once so integral to shaping public belief, began to fade, replaced by a more direct form of control. Where once these individuals had shaped the fabric of society with subtlety and skill, now the stories were controlled by those who held the power of the pen or the sword. How powerful could a story become when crafted by someone paid to influence belief? This question lingers in the air, for the power of narrative is a dangerous thing. Stories are not just tales, they are tools. And in the hands of the right storyteller, a narrative could alter the course of history. What was once a subtle, underground profession soon became obsolete in a world that sought to control stories through force rather than influence. But the legacy of the story steerers lives on, for we still see their echoes in the way stories shape our world today. As this chapter draws to a close, we recognize that the hidden professions didn't merely react to society, they shaped it. They understood that to control the story was to control the people, and through their quiet, unseen work, they held more influence than any official record or ruler could ever hope to. In the next chapter, we will explore how these hidden trades evolved from subtle influence into direct conflict with the powerful institutions that sought to suppress them. The story steerers were just the beginning. In a world where words held immense power, there existed a quiet profession, one that thrived in the shadows and never sought the light of day. These were the interpreters of forbidden correspondence. They were not employed by kings or courts, nor were they recognized by any guild. They were individuals who specialized in deciphering the messages that others wished to keep, hidden letters sealed with wax, symbols written in the margins of parchment, and coded lines nestled between seemingly innocent words. Their job was simple, yet profound. They were the ones who understood the language of secrecy, who could read the spaces between the lines and interpret the hidden meanings that others could not. The work of these interpreters was delicate. Messages often arrived wrapped in secrecy, carefully guarded and protected by layers of code, symbols, or obscure language. A simple letter might seem innocuous at first glance, but to the trained eye, it would reveal its true nature. These interpreters were the ones who could lift the wax seals, gently warmed by flames, and unravel the tangled threads of meaning beneath the surface. In dimly lit rooms, where candlelight flickered softly and parchment rustled under the weight of its secrets, they worked in silence, their minds sharp and focused. Every word, every mark, every small detail was examined with the utmost care. These interpreters were hired by those who needed to know what others sought to conceal. Noble families, merchants, and even ordinary people who found themselves caught in webs of political intrigue or personal betrayal turned to them for answers. The messages they read were not merely words, they were pieces of power, of alliances, of hidden agendas. A single deciphered letter could shift the balance of a negotiation, expose a long-hidden plot, or reveal a secret that could change the course of history. The ability to understand what was meant, not by what was written, but by what was left unsaid, made these interpreters indispensable. But their power was also their danger. To read between the lines was to see what others could not or would not see. These interpreters were often the ones who could reveal things that had been carefully concealed. The true intentions behind a leader's smile, the hidden threats in a merchant's contract, the promises made in secret between families or countries. This knowledge gave them a subtle but immense influence, one that could be used to change outcomes in ways both visible and invisible. In a world that valued control, such power was dangerous. Those in authority, the rulers, the clergy, the powerful families, understood that the ability to read hidden messages could be more powerful than the spoken word itself. If these interpreters could understand what others could not, they could expose plans, undermine alliances, and even shift the direction of entire events. And so, as the centuries passed, the role of the interpreter began to fade into the shadows. As rulers grew more anxious about controlling knowledge and communication, they tightened their grip on reading and writing, establishing rules and codes that made it harder for anyone to operate outside their purview. Eventually, these discreet interpreters were driven out of the light. Their profession was quietly erased, their skills rendered obsolete by new laws, new regulations, and the rise of centralized power. But their work, though forgotten by history, remained a reminder of the quiet rebellion that lay in the spaces between words. For in those silent acts of interpretation, the world's most powerful secrets were laid bare, and sometimes the smallest shift in understanding could change everything. Who read the messages no one else was supposed to understand? This question lingers, for the interpreters were not just readers, they were uncoverers of truth, uncoverers of what was meant to remain hidden. In the quiet rooms where parchment met flame, they shaped history with their silent comprehension, revealing what the world had tried to keep buried. As we move forward, we see that while some individuals dealt with knowledge in ways that could expose hidden truths, others became experts in hiding what was too dangerous to know. These masters of concealment would use their skills not just to interpret but to keep secrets buried, to hide knowledge from prying eyes. The next section reveals how, as the power of knowledge grew, so did the need to control it. In the dark corners of medieval society, there existed a hidden profession, one that few spoke of and fewer still understood. These were the stewards of concealed archives, the silent guardians entrusted with protecting the documents that were never meant to see the light of day. They were the keepers of letters, maps, confessions, and records, pieces of information too sensitive, too dangerous, or too powerful to be revealed to the public eye. These documents held the weight of secrets, the kind that could unravel lives, start wars, or destroy reputations. And it was the stewards who bore the responsibility of keeping these truths buried, locked away in places no one dared to look. Their work was solitary, done in the shadows where few dared to tread. These stewards moved like ghosts through darkened halls, lanterns flickering in their hands, casting long shadows against crumbling walls. They navigated the labyrinthine passages of forgotten cellars, hidden lofts, and abandoned spaces that had been repurposed as secret vaults for the documents they were sworn to protect. Each scroll, each parchment, was carefully stored in places only they could navigate, their exact locations etched into their memory like a map that no one else could read. Every corner of these secret spaces had its purpose. Every nook and cranny held its own meaning. For these stewards, the work was one of both precision and secrecy. Every document must be accounted for. Every record must be placed in its exact position to avoid the risk of revealing what was meant to remain hidden. The archives they tended were not just collections of papers, they were the threads that held together delicate webs of power. These were the records of families, of kingdoms, of empires, and sometimes of the darkest dealings that no one wished to acknowledge. The stewards were the silent sentinels, standing watch over the archives that could stop feuds before they erupted or ignite them with a single misplaced word. They were protectors of knowledge, but also keepers of power, for they understood the danger in what they guarded. A single document could tip the scales of history, destroying a reputation, exposing a betrayal, or revealing a truth too dangerous for the world to bear. But the weight of such responsibility was not without its challenges. The stewards lived in a constant balance between loyalty and fear. They understood the power of the documents they protected, but they also knew the price that came with such knowledge. To be entrusted with such secrets was to be entrusted with power, and power was dangerous. The stewards had to navigate the shifting allegiances and treacherous waters of those who sought the documents for their own gain. Some stewards became so deeply entangled in the secrets they protected that their loyalty was tested, and their lives were often at risk. The act of guarding such knowledge was as much about survival as it was about duty. As time passed, however, the very existence of these stewards became increasingly endangered. With the rise of centralized authorities and the growth of state-controlled records, the need for individuals who could manage such secret archives began to fade. Rulers and institutions began to assert their dominance over all written knowledge, claiming the right to control the flow of information. The steward's trade, once vital to maintaining balance, became a relic of a bygone era. The archives they had protected so carefully were swept into the hands of governments, and those who had once been the silent guardians of hidden knowledge were slowly erased from history. In the quiet, dimly lit spaces where these stewards once worked, the records were lost, moved to new vaults, and carefully catalogued under the watchful eyes of those in power. And yet, some still whisper of the documents that remain hidden to this day. What might be concealed in the dusty corners of forgotten cellars? What secrets still lie in the shadows, hidden by the last stewards of the old world? It is a question that stirs curiosity, for the fate of these hidden archives remains uncertain. How many secrets still lie buried, waiting to be uncovered by those daring enough to seek them out? What documents were guarded so carefully that even their guardians' names disappeared. It is a question that invites the imagination to run wild with possibilities. For while the Stewards' trade may have faded, the mysteries they protected have not. Some fragments of these lost archives may still exist, locked away in forgotten corners, their stories waiting to be unearthed. As we move to the final section of this chapter, we will see how knowledge, once hidden so carefully, began to shift from protection to manipulation. The power to guard information soon gave way to the power to alter it. Some professions didn't just keep secrets, they learned how to change the story entirely. The act of protecting knowledge would eventually give way to the act of controlling it, and with that control came a new form of influence, one far more dangerous and far-reaching. In the quiet, dimly lit rooms of medieval courts and councils, where decisions were made that shaped the fates of kingdoms and the lives of individuals, there existed a profession that operated on the very edge of truth. These were the whisper editors, individuals employed to adjust, edit, and sometimes subtly alter the written record before it reached the eyes of those in power. They were neither scribes nor strategists in the traditional sense. Instead, they navigated the delicate space between truth and survival, tasked with ensuring that documents told the right story, a story that protected those with the power to shape the narrative. At first glance, their work seemed innocuous, editing reports, softening accusations, removing dangerous implications, or choosing specific words that could mean the difference between guilt and innocence. The weight of their task was carried in the smallest of details. A single word changed in a letter could change the course of history. A phrase softened in a legal document could preserve a life. But their craft was far from simple. These whisper editors understood that to alter a single word was to shift the very fabric of reality. They were the invisible architects behind the documents that maintained order and stability, manipulating the written word with precision to ensure that power remained in the right hands. The work itself was done in silence, under the flicker of candlelight, where the ink dried slowly on parchment and every decision carried immense consequences. The tension in the air was palpable, for these editors held the power to protect or destroy, to preserve the public image of the powerful or expose their secrets. In their hands, documents were transformed not in blatant ways, but in subtle, barely noticeable adjustments that could never be traced back to their origin. These small changes were not meant to deceive outright, but to obscure, to soften, to guide perception toward a more favorable narrative. Yet, in a world where the written word was seen as sacred, where official records were considered the ultimate truth, the very existence of these whisper editors was a threat. Their ability to subtly reshape the truth threatened the purity of the written record. What was the point of having laws and decrees if someone could simply alter the narrative with a stroke of a pen? What was the value of written history if those who controlled it could change the facts without anyone knowing? The whisper editors operated in the shadows, where their work could never be acknowledged openly. They were the hidden hands that shaped public perception, keeping powerful patrons safe while ensuring that inconvenient truths stayed buried. As society began to evolve and the role of written records became more formalized, the whisper editors found their work increasingly difficult to maintain. The rise of centralized authorities and stricter control over documents meant that the subtle manipulation of truth was no longer acceptable. The written word, once a tool of political survival, became something more rigid, more guarded. The whisper editors were slowly phased out of existence, their trade erased from memory, and their craft relegated to the shadows of history. But their influence, though largely forgotten, remains in the gaps between the lines of official records, in the moments where the truth was quietly shifted to preserve power. What truths were reshaped by hands no one ever acknowledged? It is a question that lingers, for the whisper editors were not the creators of falsehoods. They were the ones who adjusted reality, who bent it to the will of those in power. Their work was not about inventing lies, but about concealing truths too dangerous to be spoken. They shaped the narrative in ways that protected the status quo, ensuring that the powerful remained unchallenged. In this subtle manipulation of language, the whisper editors held the power to rewrite the past and influence the future without ever being seen. As we move into the next chapter, the role of hidden professions shifts from shaping the narrative to dealing with forces beyond the control of human politics. In the world of the mysterious and the unexplained, knowledge is not always about power, it is about survival, and sometimes it is about what cannot be known. The next section will take us into the realm where the unknown becomes just as powerful as the known, and where the professions that once shaped history through subtle influence now turn to face the forces that defy all explanation. In the darkened corners of medieval life, where the unexplained met the everyday, there were those who dealt with the objects that fell from the sky or washed ashore after violent storms, strange stones, twisted pieces of metal, or glowing fragments of unknown origin. These were not mere curiosities. To the villagers, they were objects of mystery, potentially of great power, or worse, of danger. Medieval societies, with their limited understanding of the natural world, lacked the means to explain these unusual items. To them, these objects represented a threat far more unsettling than the ordinary dangers of disease or warfare. They were artifacts that defied the laws of nature, and in a world governed by superstition, such things could not be allowed to remain in plain sight. Thus, a small but essential group of individuals emerged guardians of these strange fallen objects. They were tasked with collecting these items, securing them, and keeping them hidden away from the prying eyes of the villagers. Their role was not one of inquiry, but of protection. Protection from fear, from panic, and from the possibility that these objects might trigger an upheaval in the very fabric of the world as it was known. They operated quietly, moving through moonlit fields, or along the thunder-rattled coastlines where the sea had cast its strange cargo. With cautious hands, they collected the remnants of what might have been celestial visitors or unnatural phenomena, storing them in secret locations, far from the reach of those who might cause a stir. In the stillness of their work, the guardians often worked alone. They kept to themselves, performing their duties with a quiet reverence for the unknown. They knew better than to draw attention to the things they guarded. Any word of these mysterious objects could send the village into a frenzy of fear, suspicion, and superstition. The guardians didn't just secure the objects, they also bore the responsibility of controlling the narrative. The less the village knew, the better. And so, these guardians became figures of quiet importance, never seeking recognition, never speaking of their duties. What did they keep hidden away? What objects were so strange, so unnerving, that their mere existence could shake the foundations of a world that was still trying to understand its place in the cosmos? The guardians knew, but they kept their knowledge close, understanding that some things were better left untouched, better left unspoken. They ensured that the villagers lived their lives in blissful ignorance, never suspecting the secrets kept just beneath the surface of their everyday world. What objects did medieval workers hide so thoroughly that history forgot they existed? This is a question that lingers, for the very existence of these strange items has faded from the collective memory. What we know of these objects is almost nothing, for the Guardians' work was done with such caution that even the most curious of historians could not uncover their secrets. Over time, the stories of these Guardians were lost, their names erased by the passing centuries, as the very nature of their work, dealing with things best left unspoken, faded into the realm of myth. Yet, these objects remained hidden, forgotten, their mysteries locked away in places where only a select few dared to tread. Perhaps they still exist, buried beneath the earth, or perhaps they have been lost entirely to time. What happened to these strange objects? Were they ever meant to be understood? The Guardians never provided answers, and in their silence, they left behind a legacy of quiet protection, a reminder that some things, no matter how strange, are best kept in the shadows. As we move forward into the next section, we will see that it wasn't only objects that sparked fear and curiosity in medieval communities. There were also the strange sounds and unexplained disturbances, whispers in the air, eerie noises in the forest, and the unsettling vibrations that seemed to emanate from deep within the earth. In the next chapter, we turn our attention to those who dealt not with the objects themselves, but with the strange occurrences that followed in their wake. These were the workers who listened to what could not be heard and interpreted the sounds that others could not understand. The guardians of the objects were just one part of a larger mystery, a mystery that was unfolding not only in the physical realm but in the very fabric of the world itself. In the silence of the medieval night, when the world was still and the stars hung heavy in the sky, there were those who heard what others could not. These were the interpreters of unnatural echoes, workers summoned when strange sounds pierced the quiet of a village, rumblings that had no cause, metallic hums that echoed in the heart of dark forests, or rhythmic pulses that emanated from the depths of abandoned wells. They were the listeners, attuned to the subtle vibrations of the earth itself, to the whispers carried on the wind, or the distant groans that seemed to come from beneath the earth. Where others heard only silence or familiar noises, these interpreters could discern patterns in the unexplainable, interpreting the strange sounds as messages from the natural world, or perhaps from something beyond. These interpreters were sought out by villagers when the air was thick with unease, when the land itself seemed to speak in ways that didn't make sense, when the ground rumbled without warning, when the forests fell silent or emitted eerie sounds. These individuals were called upon to listen. They would often spend long hours in places where the sounds originated, near caves that seemed to breathe with the pulse of the earth, in forests where the trees whispered in languages that couldn't be understood, or on mountains where the rocks groaned after dusk, as if something ancient and forgotten stirred beneath them. With their acute hearing, they could detect the faintest vibrations and determine whether they were benign or ominous, whether they foretold an impending disaster or were simply natural occurrences. The work of these interpreters was delicate and mysterious. They often recorded what they heard, not in words, but through symbols, drawings, diagrams, or cryptic marks that only they could understand. Their testimonies, spoken softly and reverently, were woven into the fabric of the village's decisions. They were not just listeners, they were guides, shaping the way the community responded to the unknown. Did the strange hum near the forest mean danger for travellers, or was it merely the sound of an approaching storm? Was the deep rumbling from the earth an omen, or simply the creaking of the land shifting in response to natural forces? The interpreters provided answers, but their interpretations were not always accepted without question. The tension between knowledge and fear, between understanding and superstition, ran deep. The people of the village depended on these interpreters to navigate the unknown, for the interpretations of the unnatural echoes were more than just idle curiosities. They were matters of life and death. They determined travel routes, hunting grounds, and safety measures. A hum that echoed through the trees could mean that dangerous animals were nearby. A low rumble from the earth might signal the approach of a natural disaster. These subtle shifts in sound and vibration shaped every aspect of village life, from the timing of seasonal hunts to the positioning of homes in relation to the land's energies. Yet, the interpreter's ability to hear what others could not made them both revered and feared. Their knowledge was a strange form of power, and as with all power, it attracted suspicion. Villagers wondered how the interpreters could hear such things. Was it simply an acute sense of hearing, or did they possess some deeper, more mystical understanding of the world? The line between gift and curse was thin, and those who held power over knowledge of the earth's hidden voices were never far from the edges of fear and superstition. Rumours spread of interpreters who, with a mere whisper, could stir the ground beneath one's feet, or who knew too much about the workings of the unseen world. As time went on, the interpreters began to fade from public life, their mysterious abilities falling out of favour as centralised powers took hold. Authorities, wary of the knowledge these individuals carried and the influence they wielded, sought to remove them from the public narrative. As written records became more formalised and communities began to place greater trust in observable facts, the interpretative profession was slowly erased. The subtle art of listening to the earth and understanding its vibrations was no longer considered useful in a world that favoured direct knowledge over ancient wisdom. What voices in the earth were only heard by those trained to listen? It is a question that lingers long after the interpreters have vanished from history. What were the sounds that they alone could hear, and what truths did they unlock in the silence of the world? Were they merely reacting to natural events, or did they hold knowledge of a deeper, more mysterious force at work beneath the surface of everyday life? As the echoes of these forgotten professions fade into the past, we move toward the final section of this chapter, where the world of the unexplained deepens even further. The tension surrounding these unnatural sounds is only the beginning. In the next section, we will explore those who dealt not just with eerie phenomena, but with darker, more sinister forces that threatened the fabric of society itself. There are journeys that take more than just time. They strip a person of something essential, leaving behind someone unrecognizable. In medieval villages, when travellers returned from distant lands or long pilgrimages, they often returned changed, not in body, but in mind and spirit. These individuals might speak in a monotone, their eyes vacant, their gait aimless, or they might wander at odd hours, consumed by an overwhelming need to walk without purpose. The villagers, frightened by these strange shifts, would often interpret these changes as curses, possession, or even the signs of an illness too dangerous to acknowledge. Fear of the unknown ran deep, and the transformation of a loved one or a once familiar face into something unrecognizable became a source of terror. In response to this fear, there were those who quietly took on the role of watchers, individuals tasked with observing these travelers who had returned, changed. These watchers were not healers or doctors, nor were they priests who might offer prayers for spiritual healing. They were caretakers of sorts, but their work was largely unseen, taking place in the dimly lit rooms of isolated homes, where the afflicted were often kept out of sight from the rest of the community. Their role was subtle yet essential. They watched over the travelers, ensuring that they did not harm themselves or others in their altered states. Often, the changes were so drastic that the afflicted person was considered a danger both to themselves and to the social fabric of the village. The watchers did not seek to cure, they simply observed. They documented the patterns of behavior, the wandering, the vacant stares, the erratic speech, and sought to understand what had happened to these individuals during their journeys. Some of the watchers built theories, trying to piece together what had triggered the transformation. Was it something that had happened on the road? A curse, perhaps? Was it a ritual, a mystical force that had taken hold? And sometimes, in the most severe cases, they would escort the afflicted to isolated areas, to places where they could be kept safe from the fear of the community, and from themselves. Yet, for all the compassion that these watchers exhibited, their role was not without its own form of fear. They were walking a fine line, caught between empathy and superstition. They had to navigate the tension of caring for the afflicted, while knowing that their work was misunderstood. To speak too openly of the changes in these travelers could spark panic, could lead to accusations of witchcraft or possession. Their silent work was both an act of care and a quiet rebellion against the overwhelming fears that plagued the village. But this secrecy came at a cost. Their work was never acknowledged publicly, and over time, it faded from the community's collective memory. What happened to the travelers who returned from their journeys changed? These watchers knew the answer, though they were rarely asked. They were the silent observers who watched over the fragile line between recovery and deeper madness, between safety and the unknown. Their quiet footsteps echoed in empty rooms, in spaces where the normal rhythms of life had been replaced by a different kind of tension, one that could not be named but was deeply felt. The work of the watchers was carried out in candlelit solitude, their lives entwined with the strange fate of those they cared for, and yet they themselves remained shadows. Their knowledge of the affliction, whether it was physical, mental, or something else entirely, was not acknowledged by the wider community, leaving them in quiet isolation as they protected the village from an invisible threat. As the years passed, the work of the watchers faded into myth, their profession slowly erased from public records, their names lost to time. But their presence lingered in the dark spaces between stories where fear of the unknown lived on, and where the boundaries between human vulnerability and mysticism blurred. They were the unseen protectors of society, the quiet guardians of a fragile human condition that could not be explained. This world of watchful silence, where hidden roles protected people from fear, leads us into the next chapter. In the coming section, we will explore how the hidden professions of the past didn't just guard against mystery, but against the very chaos that could tear society apart, acting as unseen sentinels in a world where the unknown held both power and danger. In the quietest hours of the night, when the world seemed to hold its breath, there were those who worked tirelessly to prevent the unraveling of communities. They were the unofficial mediators, the silent peacemakers, who resolved disputes long before the morning sun rose, when tempers were high, and words, once spoken, could not be taken back. Their work was not recorded in any official ledger, nor did they wear any titles or badges of authority. They were simply individuals who possessed the rare ability to diffuse tension with nothing more than calm patience and emotional intelligence. In the early hours, when villages slept and the air was thick with the potential for conflict, these mediators would move quietly through the streets, lanterns swaying gently in their hands. Their work was performed behind closed doors, in quiet courtyards, or in the hushed shadows of family homes. There, they would listen to the heated words of spouses, siblings, or neighbors, their voices rising in anger, fueled by old grudges or misunderstandings. It was in these moments that the mediators would step in, guiding the conversation with subtle, deliberate questions, shifting the dialogue away from anger and toward resolution. Their task was never easy, and it was often invisible to the wider community. They intervened before matters could escalate into violence or scandal, sometimes offering their services anonymously so that their names would never be attached to the resolution. With steady hands, they listened, offered advice, and created space for cooler heads to prevail. Their ability to stay calm and think clearly in the heat of human emotion made them indispensable, even though few knew the true scope of their work. When disputes were settled and the tension lifted, the mediators would slip quietly away, leaving only peace in their wake. The heart of their work lay in discretion and emotional intelligence. In a world where public perception was everything, to let a dispute boil over into a public spectacle could destroy reputations and tear communities apart. These mediators were aware of the fragile balance of human emotions, how easily a small argument could spiral into something larger. Whether it was a land dispute between families, a quarrel over inheritance, or simmering tensions that threatened to tear apart friendships, the mediators worked with a quiet grace, knowing that their interventions could mean the difference between peace and destruction. In a world that increasingly relied on formal legal systems, the role of these mediators began to fade. As courts and judges became more accessible, and as laws evolved to handle disputes in an official manner, the quiet work of the mediators became less necessary. Legal systems offered a more structured approach to conflict resolution, and the need for informal, behind-the-scenes peacemakers diminished. What had once been a vital role, an invisible thread holding communities together, was slowly absorbed into the official systems of justice. The mediators, who had once worked in the shadows, began to disappear. Their trade dissolved into the paperwork of courts and legal documents. Yet, the quiet brilliance of their work lives on in the memories of those who had benefited from it. The soft murmur of voices in the night, the flicker of lanterns illuminating private disputes, the subtle art of keeping a community intact, these things were never written in history books, but they were no less important for it. Without these mediators, many villages would have fallen into chaos long before the rise of official courts and judges. Who kept villages from falling apart during the darkest hours of the night? It is a question that invites reflection on the quiet heroes whose work was hidden from public view, whose efforts ensured the survival of communities, and whose names were never written into the annals of history. As we shift our focus, we will begin to explore other unseen roles. Individuals whose actions went beyond households and families, protecting entire towns from forces that could have torn them apart. There were workers whose trade existed in the shadows, where every movement was laden with danger and every decision carried the potential for destruction. These were the risk-takers who handled unstable materials, substances too volatile, too dangerous for the common folk to touch. Early oils, quick-burning powders, and experimental mixtures formed the heart of their trade, and every task they performed was a delicate dance between precision and peril. Whether it was transporting flammable oils for lamps, handling the volatile chemicals used in early gunpowder, or dealing with the mysterious substances that could set a home alight or turn a marketplace into a disaster, these workers had to move with care, their nerves steeled against the constant threat of catastrophe. Their work was done in silence, often in the dim light of flickering lanterns or the glow of embers. The soft clink of clay jars being moved, the careful balance of fragile containers filled with something that could explode with the slightest mistake. It was an atmosphere thick with tension. These workers understood that the slightest slip could be fatal. Their hands trembled not out of fear, but from the weight of responsibility that came with handling materials capable of wreaking havoc. To store, transport, and sometimes neutralize these dangerous substances, they had to be precise, unwavering, and above all, invisible. Any hint of their work, any misstep, could lead to disaster not just for themselves, but for entire communities. The materials they dealt with were not to be spoken of aloud. It was a trade built on secrecy, for to acknowledge the presence of such unstable substances in one's community was to invite fear. Merchants might seek these volatile materials in secret, asking for deliveries that had no official documentation, while the workers themselves were often referred to in whispers trusted, but never fully understood. Even the families that relied on these substances, the townspeople who needed the oils, powders, and mixtures for daily life, remained unaware of the danger that silently hummed beneath the surface of their existence. What medieval workers handled things so dangerous they weren't allowed to speak of them? The answer lies in the precision with which they carried out their work. It wasn't just a matter of transporting materials, it was about keeping them from the eyes of others, about ensuring that no one else understood the true nature of the substances they handled. The materials themselves were often marked by secrecy, kept in hidden rooms, transported in the dead of night, or stored in places where only the trusted could go. To see one of these workers handling such substances was to understand that some things were too dangerous to discuss openly. Their knowledge was a silent power, a knowledge that could either save or destroy. As the years passed and safer methods of handling these materials began to emerge, the role of these risk-takers diminished. With the rise of centralized authorities and stricter controls over hazardous substances, the trade faded into the background. No longer were such materials handled in secrecy by lone individuals, they were now managed by formal systems, regulated by laws, and overseen by institutions. The once hidden workers, who had existed on the fringe of society, disappeared, leaving only rumors behind. Stories of their work and their bravery, often exaggerated, sometimes fictionalized, remained in whispered tales passed down by those who remembered when such dangerous tasks had been essential to survival. The trade of handling unstable materials, though largely forgotten, still lives in the space between history and myth. The workers who dealt with such volatile substances left behind no grand monuments, no official records, only the fragile memory of their work. The jars they carried, the powders they mixed, and the delicate balance they maintained have all been swallowed by time, replaced by safer methods and formalized processes. But the tension of their trade remains, a ghostly echo of the unseen dangers they navigated, hidden beneath the surface of the world that has long since forgotten their work. Their presence, however, sets the stage for a final, more profound profession, one that balanced not the dangers of physical substances, but the emotional stability of entire communities. In the final section of this chapter, we will turn our focus to those whose role was to protect society not from explosions or fires, but from the chaos of fear and uncertainty. The work of these individuals was just as essential, yet it was perhaps even more invisible, dealing not with physical materials, but with the human mind itself. In times of chaos, when fear rose like a tide, threatening to engulf entire villages, there were those who stood at the center, silently steering the storm. These were the emotional stewards, individuals whose sole purpose was to calm and soothe the panic-stricken masses. When fires raged through marketplaces, when strange lights appeared in the sky, or when an illness suddenly swept through the community, these stewards would step forward, wielding nothing but their presence and their voice. They understood that fear could spread faster than any disease, and that in a crowd, panic was a contagion more dangerous than any visible threat. Their work was subtle, an art that was never acknowledged openly, but one that was vital to maintaining peace and order. In a world where explanations were often scarce, where the unknown stirred fear in the hearts of even the bravest, these stewards had a quiet but powerful gift, the ability to influence emotions. Through carefully controlled gestures, measured words, and strategic storytelling, they could guide the collective emotional energy of a crowd, shifting it from hysteria to calm. Their voice, low and steady, would cut through the rising panic like a steady hand on a trembling pulse. A single phrase, whispered at the right moment, could quiet a room, while a simple gesture could steer a crowd away from the brink of violence. The scenes were often tense, marketplaces on the edge of chaos, voices shouting over each other, the panic palpable in the air. Then, in the center of the turmoil, a figure would emerge, a quiet presence amidst the storm. This individual would not demand attention but would simply stand still, commanding it without effort. A slow raising of a hand, a soft word in the ear of a leader, or a slight change in posture would shift the crowd's focus. And then, with a few calm words, spoken like a lullaby, the air would change. The panic would subside, the crowd would settle, and the marketplace would return to order as if nothing had ever happened. These emotional stewards understood crowd psychology instinctively. They knew how to read the room, how to sense the rising tension, the subtle shifts in mood, the quickening of breath and heartbeat. They knew that in times of crisis, a leader's emotional state could dictate the mood of an entire village. A calm presence would inspire calm, an anxious one would spread anxiety. They acted not through force, but through a quiet, almost invisible influence. This made them invaluable. They were the unsung architects of public order, the silent guardians of social stability. But such power came with its own dangers. As with all subtle influence, there was suspicion. While the stewards did not openly manipulate, their ability to control emotions made others wary. What was the true nature of this power? Could it be used for purposes less benign? As society grew more formalized and centralized authorities began to take control of public order, the role of these stewards was quietly phased out. Official systems of policing and law began to replace the more organic, community-based ways of managing panic. The soft power of these stewards was no longer necessary, and their profession faded from public life, eventually vanishing from record entirely. What kind of person could quiet an entire crowd with only a whisper? The answer is a person who understands the fragility of the human mind, someone who can navigate the fine line between influence and manipulation, between calming and controlling. These stewards were the masters of emotional alchemy, turning raw fear into steady calm. They could hold the pulse of a community in their hands and, with the right touch, smooth the frayed edges of a volatile moment. As we move forward into the next chapter, we will shift from the management of fear to the management of life's most fragile moments, the moments when individuals and families are on the brink, and society must respond not with order, but with empathy. In Chapter 9, we explore the professionals who dealt with the end of life itself and the delicate balance between preserving dignity and understanding the emotional weight of loss. The work of the emotional stewards set the stage for those who would care for the final stages of life's journey. There are moments in life when words are not enough, when the quiet presence of another person is all that is needed. For the dying, the final moments were often met with more than just the absence of life. They were met with the presence of those who stayed by their side, gently guiding them from one world to the next. These were the Nightward tenders, individuals whose profession was as simple as it was profound: to sit with the dying during their final hours, to keep them company through long nights, and to ensure they were not alone in their journey from life to death. The Nightward tenders did not possess any great powers or extraordinary skills. They were not doctors or healers, and they were rarely involved in medical decisions. Their work was more subtle, keeping a lamp lit, reciting soft words, offering comfort in the face of the inevitable. They kept watch over the fading life, offering a sense of continuity and peace during moments of great uncertainty. In their presence, the dying were allowed to pass not with fear, but with a quiet dignity, knowing they were not alone in the darkest hours. These tenders worked in the quiet spaces of homes, where the rhythm of life had slowed to a hush. The flicker of candles cast shadows on the walls, and the soft sound of breathing filled the air, a reminder of the tenuousness of life. It was in these moments, when the world outside was still, that the tenders did their work. They would sit at the bedside, their faces soft with understanding, offering the comfort of presence when nothing else could ease the passing of time. They were the emotional bridges between life and death, providing a steady hand for those who had no choice but to let go. And yet, for all their importance, the work of the Nightward tenders was rarely spoken of. Communities understood the value of their work, but because death itself was so often feared and misunderstood, it was something that went unacknowledged. The Nightward tenders were not celebrated. Their profession was never recognized publicly. The work they did was too intimate, too deeply tied to the most vulnerable moments of human existence, and so it remained in the shadows. People were grateful for the tenders' work, but only in the quietest, most personal moments, when no one else was around to witness the quiet acts of kindness and compassion that unfolded. The tender's role was never about heroism or grandeur. It was about small gestures, adjusting a blanket, offering a comforting touch, whispering gentle reassurances in the dark. These actions might seem simple, but in the context of death, they were the threads that held the fabric of dignity together. They were the ones who ensured that the transition between life and death was as peaceful as possible, providing a steady presence when nothing else could. In their hands, the final moments became more than just an end. They became an opportunity for calm, for quiet, and for acceptance. As time passed and societal structures shifted, the role of the Nightward tenders began to fade. Formal caregiving roles emerged, with trained individuals stepping in to offer medical care and psychological support. The tender, quiet work of those who sat by the dying was replaced by institutions and systems that could offer more formalized, structured care. As a result, the profession of the Nightward tender quietly disappeared. Their work, though deeply impactful, became something that was remembered less and less. Who sat quietly beside those taking their final breaths, night after night? It is a question that echoes in the quiet spaces of memory, for these individuals were the unsung heroes of the dying process. Their work was never recorded in the annals of history, but it was no less important for it. They were the ones who offered comfort when it was most needed, and in doing so, they gave something far more precious than medicine or treatment their presence. The fading of this profession marks the end of an era, but the memory of those quiet hours spent by the bedside remains in the hearts of those who remember. As we move to the next section, we will explore what happens after death, when the work of those who tend to the living must give way to those who manage the aftermath, to those who prepare spaces for mourning, and to those who navigate the delicate rituals that surround loss. In the silent spaces between life and death, where the air is thick with emotion and the weight of loss hangs heavy, there were those who quietly shaped the places where farewells were made. These were the distant arrangers, the workers tasked with preparing spaces for mourning, ensuring that the environment surrounding death was as orderly, sacred, and meaningful as possible. Their job was not to mourn, but to create a space where mourning could happen. They worked in the background, arranging candles, clearing paths, and carefully selecting symbolic items to ensure that the transition from life to death felt as dignified and structured as the living world itself. The arrangers knew that rituals and physical spaces played a powerful role in how people experienced loss. They understood that grief, though deeply personal, could be eased by an environment that spoke to the soul's need for closure. Whether it was setting up a wake, preparing a burial site, or simply arranging the home of the deceased for the family to say their goodbyes, these workers transformed an ordinary space into something sacred. A simple room could be turned into a chapel, a backyard into a cemetery, or a kitchen into a space for quiet remembrance. Through their careful attention to detail, they allowed families to navigate their grief in a way that felt both organized and deeply personal. Their work began long before the family arrived. They would light the candles that would flicker softly in the corners, casting a gentle glow over the space. They would place symbols of remembrance flowers, keepsakes, and personal items near the body, to create a connection between the living and the dead. Paths were cleared, and ritual objects placed in specific locations to guide the emotional flow of the mourning. The arrangers ensured that every detail was in its place, and they knew that their work had the power to shape how the grieving family experienced the next few days. In this quiet space, there was no rush, no distractions. The arrangers created an atmosphere of calm, where those who were left behind could quietly reflect, mourn, and find some semblance of order in the chaos of loss. These arrangers didn't just handle the logistics, they also provided emotional support, though never overtly. They understood the unspoken needs of the grieving, and often worked with the family to ensure that their wishes were carried out, while also offering gentle guidance on how to conduct certain rituals. While they were not officiants or spiritual leaders, they understood the power of ritual and symbolism in healing. They helped families navigate their sorrow through the language of the material world, arranging the objects of their grief to reflect the solemnity of the occasion and the emotional needs of those involved. As with many hidden professions, the work of the distant arrangers was never fully acknowledged. They were not celebrated for their craftsmanship or attention to detail, but their role was no less vital for it. Communities depended on their services, but in times of religious reform and the increasing institutionalization of rituals, their trade began to fade. Religious authorities eventually took over the formalization of mourning rituals, codifying the steps, rules, and guidelines for preparing the body, preparing the space, and preparing the family. The distant arranger's role was no longer seen as necessary, and their delicate balance of practical and emotional support was absorbed into more structured systems. Over time, their profession dissolved into the more official aspects of religious funerary practices. What unseen hands shaped the spaces where medieval people said their goodbyes? These hands, though largely forgotten, played an essential part in shaping the mourning process. ensuring that the final act of life was not only marked but respected. Their quiet work ensured that families could say goodbye with dignity, with order, and with meaning. The arrangers worked in silence, their presence never acknowledged in the public records, but their influence remained in the soft glow of candlelight, in the carefully arranged flowers, and in the solemnity that marked each farewell. As the chapter closes, we move toward the final profession of the chapter, those who were not just concerned with the spaces around grief, but with the mysteries that surrounded it. These individuals observed the strange happenings that could follow grief, sleepwalking, strange dreams, or even unexplainable behavior that could not be explained by grief alone. Their role was one of quiet observation, and their work was as much about protecting the living from the unknown as it was about understanding the depths of human sorrow. In the aftermath of death, when the veil between life and the beyond seemed thin, there were those who watched over the living, those who stayed behind after the body was laid to rest, monitoring the household for signs of disturbance. These were the watchers, individuals whose role was not just to care for the mourners, but to observe the strange phenomena that could follow in the wake of grief. It was believed that death left an imprint, not just on the body, but on the soul. Those left behind could suffer from the weight of sorrow, but they could also experience more unsettling effects, unexplained behaviors, disturbances of the mind and spirit that defied easy understanding. Medieval people believed these signs sleepwalking, sudden bouts of fear, hallucinations, or strange dreams were spiritual disturbances, manifestations of the departed's restless spirit, or the toll of grief on the soul. The watchers were the ones who stood guard during the long nights, keeping silent vigil to ensure that these signs did not spiral into something more dangerous. They were the quiet sentinels, positioned just outside the home or within earshot, ensuring that the grieving did not lose their way into madness or spiritual disarray. Their work was subtle, almost invisible. They did not intrude, but watched closely, listening for signs of disturbance, perhaps a family member walking through the house at an hour when the night was still and the moon high, perhaps a sudden cry in the dark, or a quiet sobbing from another room. These disturbances, the watchers believed, were not simply the products of an overactive mind, but signs of something deeper, forces beyond the comprehension of the living, lurking just beneath the surface of grief. They were guardians not just of the household, but of the fragile emotional boundaries between the living and the dead. The watchers knew the danger of allowing such disturbances to grow unchecked. Grief could be a consuming force, but when mixed with the belief that the dead were still present, perhaps lingering in the shadows, still attached to their former lives, it could lead to panic, to fear, and sometimes to madness. If the mourners were left alone to confront their emotions without guidance, or if they were overwhelmed by what they saw as spiritual presence, their sorrow could become something far more destructive. The watchers acted as a buffer, ensuring that the grieving could process their emotions without succumbing to paranoia, obsession, or irrational fear. They were there to listen, to reassure, to help the living stay grounded in the face of loss, but also in the face of what was believed to be the supernatural. The work of the watchers was quiet, almost dreamlike. In the dark of the night, they would move quietly through the house, observing without intervening, making their presence known only when absolutely necessary. Their work was not about confrontation, but about subtle reassurance, about offering silent protection to those who might be too vulnerable to understand the forces at play. The emotional weight of grief was heavy enough. The watchers understood that the added fear of something unexplained, something supernatural, could break even the most resilient spirit. And so, they watched, staying close to those in need, without intruding on their sacred space. What did medieval watchers fear would follow grief into the night? The answer lay in the whispers, in the shifting shadows, in the moments of unexplainable terror that could creep into the lives of the mourners. The watchers feared the fragile nature of the human mind in grief, how easily it could be broken by the unknown, how easily it could be consumed by the belief that death had not truly released its grip. They feared that the mourning process could turn inward, that the sorrow of loss could become a storm that swept away all reason and left only terror in its wake. Yet, as the world began to change, as the forces of superstition faded and medicine and psychology began to rise, the role of the watcher diminished. Explanations for the strange signs of grief shifted from spiritual disturbances to psychological responses. Sleepwalking, hallucinations, and other behaviors were now understood as the mind's way of processing trauma, not as the presence of spirits. The Watchers, once so necessary, became obsolete, their profession lost in the annals of time. The rising focus on rationality and medicine replaced their quiet, spiritual role. As the Watchers faded into history, so did the world they inhabited, a world where the boundaries between life and death were blurred, where grief could be as mysterious and as fearsome as the unknown forces that were thought to govern it. But their story still lingers, and the question remains: what might still be hidden in the spaces between life and death? And what remains of the professions that once kept the fragile balance between the living and the spirits? This journey through the hidden professions of the past brings us to the final chapter, where the line between the known and the unknown becomes even more elusive. The mysteries of grief, death, and the supernatural give way to the forces that sought to control them, and the final, powerful professions that shaped both the visible and invisible aspects of society. There is a moment in history when the need for the invisible, the quiet professions of society, begins to fade, a moment when the delicate web that once held together communities starts to unravel. In medieval times, there were those who operated in the shadows, whose trades were neither acknowledged nor celebrated, but whose work was essential to the smooth functioning of society. These workers, keepers of secrets, healers in the dark, mediators in silence, were the ones who ensured that everyday life continued without interruption, even when the unknown crept too close. Yet, as time marched on, the very forces that had made them necessary began to change. Shifting beliefs, the rise of formal institutions, and the spread of literacy slowly edged these workers out of existence. Their roles, once vital and respected in their quiet corners, were now deemed unnecessary. What had once been mysterious, important work was suddenly seen as inconvenient or even dangerous. As the world began to look more rationally at issues of life, death, and power, the practices of those who had guided people through the unknown were no longer understood. New systems of control, government, religion, and law began to formalize what had once been left to intuition and personal knowledge. Communities no longer needed mediators who could quietly guide emotions or interpreters who read the hidden meanings in letters. The law and written words began to govern. The invisible workforce that once supported society was now a relic of the past. These professions, often whispered about, feared, or misunderstood, vanished as the world moved toward a more structured, less secretive way of life. They disappeared quietly, as society began to prize efficiency, bureaucracy, and written records over the unspoken bonds that had once held everything together. What happens when society no longer needs the people who once held it together? It's a question that speaks not just to the workers themselves, but to the very essence of change in human history. What happens to the quiet voices that once provided stability and peace when their work is no longer valued? The answer lies in the shifting tides of progress, where old ways give way to new, and the people who once filled the gaps are quietly erased from memory. As we reflect on the disappearing workforce, we see how these hidden trades were essential to the structure of medieval life, even if their practitioners never received the recognition they deserved. But the forces that swept through society, cultural shifts, growing institutions, and advances in knowledge made these roles obsolete, leaving behind only fragments of a lost world. Their erasure was not merely a product of time, it was a consequence of societal evolution. To understand why they vanished is to understand how the world moved from intuition and secrecy to regulation and structure. As we continue, we will dive deeper into the forces that led to the erasure of these professions, exploring how societal changes, both cultural and institutional, systematically removed them from the records. The quiet, hidden trades that once shaped the fabric of medieval life offer a window into a time when the unknown was managed with intuition, discretion, and personal knowledge before it became something to be controlled, documented, and regulated. As society evolved, so too did its need for control and order. The world of medieval trades, where mystery, secrecy, and intuition held sway, was gradually swept away by the growing forces of authority, regulation, and standardization. Fear played its part in this transformation, as did the need for institutions to maintain control over the complexities of human behavior and belief. The strange, the quiet, and the unaligned were no longer seen as necessary. In fact, they were increasingly viewed as dangerous, unpredictable, and ultimately dispensable. In this shifting landscape, many of the professions that had once provided vital services to society, unseen and often misunderstood, were erased from history, their practitioners left behind as relics of a forgotten past. The very nature of history tends to simplify. It favors narratives that are easy to understand, that fit neatly into a framework of cause and effect. The complexities of life, with its shadows and ambiguities, rarely make it into the annals of formal records. The hidden trades of the medieval world, those performed in secret, with subtlety and discretion, did not fit into this tidy structure. They existed in the spaces between the known and the unknown, in the grey areas of human existence. But as societies grew more structured, and as official records became the dominant form of history, these trades were buried beneath the weight of a new order, where control, clarity, and predictability reigned. Fear played a central role in this erasure. The very practices that had been vital to human survival and social stability were now seen as untrustworthy, even threatening. The rituals of healing, of interpreting signs and symbols, of guarding secrets, all were now associated with superstition, witchcraft, or madness. The unknown was no longer something to be managed through intuition or personal knowledge. It was something to be conquered, understood, and controlled. As institutions, church, state, and law took on more power, they systematically wiped out these hidden professions, replacing them with formalized systems of authority. Laws were written, boundaries drawn, and what had once been a complex and flexible world of human expertise became a simplified and regulated domain. Yet, as we reflect on this transformation, we begin to see how deeply these trades were woven into the fabric of medieval life. They were not merely a collection of forgotten roles, they were the quiet backbone of communities. The healing that occurred in dark corners, the secrets preserved in hidden archives, the emotional support offered in times of crisis, all were essential to the survival of a community. People relied on these hidden trades more than they realized, for these professions provided the emotional stability, the subtle guidance, and the survival tactics that allowed society to function when the known world failed them. Why did history keep only the trades that made sense and bury the ones that didn't? This question brings us face to face with the uncomfortable truth that history is often a product of convenience and power. The trades that were deemed too strange, too quiet, or too unaligned with the emerging values of authority were buried, not because they lacked significance, but because they did not fit the emerging narrative of control and order. Their erasure was not a neutral process. It was a deliberate act of simplification, a way of shaping the past to reflect a more manageable, predictable future. This process of erasure highlights the tension between the complexity of human experience and the desire to fit that experience into a neat, official framework. The trades that once operated in the spaces between known and unknown, between the visible and invisible, were sidelined because they could not be easily categorized, controlled, or understood. In their place, new professions emerged, ones that conformed to the needs of an institutionally driven world. These new roles were easier to manage, easier to regulate, and easier to write down in official records. But in the process, the richness of the old world was lost, leaving behind only fragments of the invisible workers who had once shaped its course. As we move toward the final section of this chapter, we begin to understand that these erased professions were more than just a footnote in history. They were the lifeblood of a time when knowledge was passed down through experience, intuition, and the careful preservation of secrets. The simplicity of history's narrative does not erase the complexity of those lost professions, it only hides it. And as we peer into the shadows of the past, we uncover the stories of those whose work once held society together, and whose silence now speaks volumes about the cost of progress. As the stories of forgotten professions fade into the folds of history, it becomes apparent that the echoes of these vanished trades have not completely disappeared. Though many of the individuals who once performed these roles are long gone, traces of their work remain embedded in the fabric of our world. Hidden in the most unexpected places, these traces are preserved in folklore, strange idioms, and forgotten customs. The places we pass every day, the crumbling corners of ancient buildings, the silent spaces between landmarks, the subtle shifts in our language hold fragments of these lost professions. reminders that the world was once a different place, shaped by forces we may never fully understand. Consider the old tales passed down through generations, the stories that speak of mysterious figures who could heal with whispered words or interpret omens with a glance. These are not merely stories, they are echoes of real practices, real people who once shaped the lives of their communities. Even the idioms we use today, expressions that seem to have no clear origin, are often rooted in ancient customs and forgotten trades. Phrases about fate, omens, and the unknown still linger in our language, remnants of a time when such concepts held real weight. In architecture, the strange and unexplained can also be found. Odd nooks in old homes, hidden chambers in castles, or peculiar symbols etched into doorways speak to a time when secrecy and protection were integral to the design of the world around us. These features weren't simply ornamental, they were practical, designed to conceal, protect, or ward off something that might have been too dangerous to face head-on. These architectural remnants are like silent witnesses to a history that is never spoken, only hinted at in the way buildings stand and the spaces they contain. And yet, while these traces are all that remains of the hidden professions, they are far from insignificant. The presence of these subtle markers in our world invites us to imagine what else might still be waiting in the shadows, buried just beneath the surface of our everyday lives. If these trades were hidden so thoroughly, what else might still be waiting in the shadows? It is a question that echoes through time, drawing us toward the unexplored, the forgotten, the mysterious. What knowledge, what trades, what roles have we lost in the pursuit of progress? And perhaps more importantly, what might still be hidden, waiting to be uncovered? These quiet mysteries do not need to be answered, they are meant to be pondered. For in their very mystery, they remind us of the complexity of human history, of the countless lives and trades that once shaped our world, yet slipped through the cracks of time. The erasure of these professions is not just a loss of knowledge, it is a loss of perspective, a loss of the understanding that not everything can be neatly categorized, not everything can be controlled, and not everything can be written down in books. The hidden professions may have disappeared, but their influence lingers. Their work continues to shape us in ways we don't fully understand, through the rituals we observe, the stories we tell, and the spaces we occupy. As we move through the world, we carry the weight of their legacy, even if we never fully recognize it. These hidden threads, woven into the fabric of society, remind us that there is more to our history than what is visible on the surface. And it is this unseen, mysterious part of our past that continues to invite curiosity, reflection, and, perhaps, a little bit of wonder. As we close this chapter, the questions remain. What else is hidden in the shadows? What forgotten trades still shape the world around us, quietly influencing our thoughts, our actions, and our beliefs? The story of these forgotten professions doesn't end here. It continues in the spaces between the known and the unknown, in the mysteries that still await discovery. And perhaps, in the quiet of the night, as we reflect on all that we've learned, we'll find ourselves listening for the echoes of those lost trades, wondering what they might reveal about the world that still remains to be uncovered.